right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the building detail dashboard, and here's my agenda. We already talked about that. I'll skip that. We'll get right into the building detail dashboard. Now, if you're familiar with other dashboards, when we talk about a learner detail dashboard, that's where you look at data for a single learner. Same idea here with a building. Building detail means we're going to be looking at a lot of information for a single building. And one of the neat features in this new dashboard is, for the first time, we have the ability to compare data from one date range to another date range. So you can look at them side by side. One school year compared to another school year. You could say one semester compared to a previous semester. You can decide what date ranges you want to see. And you can also select multiple forms to pull into this report, but you kind of want to be thoughtful about how you pull those reports in to make sure it doesn't get too big and difficult to use. And I will talk about that in a little bit more detail when we get in and actually look at the dashboard. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the website here where we look at that first panel. And I'm in here now, and I've gone to my dashboards bubble. And I have the building detail dashboard here. This is the relatively new one. Some of you may have noticed it in the past couple of weeks. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on the edit link here for my saved parameters, so I can show you what the parameters pieces look like. And we have this is a demo organization, and I'm assigned to 3 buildings, and so I can select the building that I'm interested in here. And then we have the primary date range, works like any other report that we have. Then we have a multi-select on the forms. And then we have the new piece here, the comparison date range. So again, you can decide to compare whatever 2 date ranges you want. Even if you want to have them overlap, you can do that. We don't care. You can put in any 2 date ranges you want. You have your primary date range up here, the comparison date range down here. The thing that you need to consider is, what are the forms I need to include for all of these date ranges? So for example, if your district in this past school year was using version 3 of the form, and the year prior you were using version 2, if you were going to compare one year to another, you'd want to make sure you pulled in both forms. Otherwise, if you're just looking at one form, then it probably just makes sense just to leave it as is. It'll be easier to read. The more forms you pull in, the longer and bigger your charts are going to get, because some of these charts list every element that comes back. And so when you start pulling in every single element from all the forms, that can get pretty lengthy. So again, you can add as many forms as you want, but we recommend that you keep it targeted in order to have a more readable report. And again, primary date range, comparison date range, this is a new feature to allow you to have a comparison. And then you just have a standard selector here on whether or not you want to include evaluative information or not. So then when I run this report, I get this dashboard that we see here. And what I have here is a demo org with fake data. In the PowerPoint presentation, I have put together a mock-up of more meaningful looking data that's better to look at than what we have in this demo organization. It's more representative of what you'll see. So I'm going to go back and forth showing the data in the slides. That's going to be a little bit easier to read, and then showing some of the functionality here in this actual dashboard using this demo organization. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to work my way down, starting at the top, and I'm just going to go through each one of these and talk about what these different slides are showing. So the first one here, pretty standard, building observation type count. You've got your formal, your informal walkthroughs, and so on. One thing I want to say about the data that you're seeing in here is that this data, this report is intended to monitor the observation practices going on within a building. So we intentionally do not include data from organization level observers. So org admins, org observers who do observations in this building, their data is not included in here. Instead, we're looking at the data for the building observers, the building administrators, because this report is, one of its primary functions is to look and see how observations are going there. And we don't want to muddy the data by bringing in an org observer who could skew some of the results. So again, this is building focused. looking at the data that the building level individuals are producing. So going back to the presentation here, working down our way down to the panels. The first one is that formal type count. The next one is this score summary piece. And if you have been using almost any of the other dashboards, you've probably seen this before. But just to make sure everybody's on the same page, I'm going to go over the functionality on this because it is a tool that lets you explore data, not just view it. So when you come into this page, it would look like this. It would show the forms that you had selected. It shows the count of scores for the date range that you selected that were for that form, the average score from all learners, all the observers in the building, all the elements. What's the average score? In this case, it's 2.8. And then I can drill down. So I can open this up, and then I can see, in this case, we're looking at lesson segments. But if you're not using a standard Marzano form or you have a different framework, this is just going to show the categories of the forms that you have. So if you have a different form, maybe a leadership form, it's going to show different information here. It's going to show the categories. And then if I open that up, I can see the subcategories. So right now I'm looking at design question 2 and design question 3. And I can see here we've got 14 scores in design question 3 and 16 scores in design question 2. I can tell my average, I'm generally doing a little bit better in design question 3 because my average is a little higher there. And these roll up too. So if I look at 16 and 14, I add those together, I get 30. So the 30 scores in lesson segments addressing content, the 30 scores in lesson segments addressing content come from design question 2 and design question 3. So you can see how this kind of builds up. These scores build up to here. And then if we just look at the lesson segments, they all build up together too. Now, if I drill down into a design question, I can now see all of the elements within that design question. I can see how often they were, how many times they were scored and the average score for each one of those. So I can see, we're doing a lot better with, reflecting on learning than organizing students to interact with new knowledge. But in both cases, we've only got one score in each one of them. Now, again, I can look at the elements for an individual design question, but I can also move out to a higher level. So let's say I want to look at all the elements in lesson segments addressing content. I can just click on this list icon here. It gives me a little different view, and now I see everything in lesson segments addressing content, regardless of what design question or subcategories they're in. I can then go back, and if I wanted to, I could look at everything in domain 1. So now it gives me all the elements in domain 1 if I wanted to look at it in that way, that perspective. So again, this is not just a standard table. You can open it up, explore it, and do your own analysis of the data that you see there. The next piece that we're going to see is the score distribution by element. So each element is represented in a row, and then we see the score distribution for that, the innovating being a green, and the applying being a blue, and then developing a yellow, beginning a red, and then not using black. And again, if you use a different framework that uses different scoring, you'll see similar colors, but it'll accommodate whatever framework that you're using. And so then you can look at this and you can see generally there's some elements where we're doing a lot better than others. You can also look at this and see, maybe where there are some score distributions that don't make a lot of sense. Kind of odd here that everybody is doing, applying or innovating at celebrating success. We never got any sort of lower scores there. With a big enough base of observations, you would think that we would at least, a couple times would have seen something in here. So maybe this is an area we want to investigate further to see that we've got, good understanding of this particular element. Oops, sorry, I went the wrong way. And so you can use this chart to find different kinds of information. There's a couple different stories that could be told by looking at the score distribution for each one of the elements. And then I'm going to go back over here to the demo site to show you something here that when you hover over these, they tell you information about that segment. And so here I can see what form was being used. So again, if you pulled in multiple forms, you're going to see a lot of these listed. It's going to be a big list. It'll help you see which form they came from, what the count was, and what score is being referenced here. The next piece that we're going to take a look at is the score frequency by element. And what this does is it puts the most popular elements at the top and the least popular elements at the bottom, and then shows the percentage that element was scored. So it looks at for everything that came back, for the forms that were selected, of all the scores that were given, how many of those scores were for this particular element? And so in this example here in this slide, you can see that 13.4% of the scores were for providing clear learning goals and scales, whereas only 2.96% of the scores were for chunking content into digestible bites. So this will help you identify maybe some elements that are getting not enough focus. Maybe there's some elements that you could argue are getting too much of a focus, that too much time has been spent on scoring a handful of elements. So if we go back to the demo site here, you can see this. Again, this is listed here showing which elements are the most frequently used, providing clear learning goals and scales. Up at the top with 16.33%. And our least popular one on the chart is using academic games. However, I will say that this is something we want to update. But right now, if an element was never scored, it won't appear in this list. And so that's something we'd like to update in the future, is if it had 0%, that you would still see it on this chart. Next piece that we have shows an average score distribution for the teachers in that given time range. And what it does is it finds the lowest average score, in this case a 2.4, and the highest average score, in this case a 3.4, and it uses those as bookends and then fills in the middle with every single score rounded to 1 decimal place, and then shows a count of how many teachers have that average score. So in this example, we have 40 teachers who are averaging 3 and 24 teachers who are averaging 3.1. And one important thing to mention here is that this has absolutely nothing to do with evaluation scoring. This is based on the raw observation data. So if your district uses average scoring, this score does not necessarily indicate what you're getting in your evaluation. Your evaluation rules, even if you're doing average scoring, could exclude some elements. Sometimes, even if you're doing averaging, you give a different weight to some scores over another. And so, again, this does not have anything to do with evaluation scoring. If you're doing conjunctive scoring, a 3 here does not relate to the 3 in the conjunctive scoring. This is strictly looking at the raw data coming from the observations and calculating that average. So what you would hope to see here is, probably a nice score distribution, a nice kind of bell curve. You wouldn't want to see, clear chunks of, everybody was getting scored just a 3 or just a 2. You'd want to see something that indicated a little bit more thoughtful scoring. So this will sometimes help you identify some outliers and maybe some behaviors that you'd want to see changed when it comes to scoring. The next piece shows us the average score distribution for not the average, but the score distribution for observers. If I switch back over to our demo org here, I'm going to scroll down to that. You see that on the side here. It shows each one of our observers, and it shows their score distribution. And we go back to the chart here. One thing that this can identify is sometimes in some buildings you've got like a good cop, bad cop scenario going on. You have one observer who gives all the bad scores and one observer who gives all the good scores. That may or may not be what you want to have happening. It could be that something that you'd want to correct, but it could be that that's a case where that's exactly what should be happening, is that maybe somebody is doing a lot of observations on first-year teachers or teachers who are on a probationary plan or some sort. And so maybe you would expect that observer to have a different kind of score distribution versus somebody else. Or maybe that isn't what you expect to see, and that's something that should be calibrated. So it depends on the situation if a difference in scoring is something that needs to be addressed. But this will help you identify that, and then you can decide whether or not that needs to have any action taken there. Next piece shows us the percent of scores at each level that included a comment. And so what this is showing us is that in this example, the not using score had 100% of those scores had comments, and about 95% at beginning had a comment, about 98% at developing. And so what you want to see probably is a nice high percentage of comments at the lower score level, indicating that, when observers gave a lower score, they told somebody why they gave them that lower score to help them improve their practice. And then typically you might see some lower percentages here for the higher level scores where feedback may not be as necessary. But again, this will depend on the policies in your own school district. There are some districts that want to see comments left on almost every score. And so you would look at this a little differently, and you may want to look at 100% or close to 100% going across everything. Again, depends on your district and what you want to see in this chart, but it could help identify some places to take action. This is probably the hardest chart to read. What this shows is every bar here represents how many times an observer scored that element. Now, if you are going to be looking at an elementary school that only has one principal who does all the observations, this chart will not be very helpful because it will just show one big bar for everything because that one person did all the observations. So this probably has more application in a situation where maybe you have a principal and assistant principal who do observations, or maybe you have a high school that has a lot of different observers assigned to it. And so it depends on the situation if this chart's really going to have any meaningful data. But what this will help you identify is, are there some observers who are focusing on certain elements more than others? So in this case, we can see this kind of bluish, purplish color here on the left side has a high frequency of scores at these top level elements. But these other ones down here, like chunking content and digestible bytes, there's only one score. There's none on elaborating new information. Whereas this other score, this other observer over here who has the lighter blue, you can see they have a greater kind of more even distribution in here. Now, again, similar to what we talked about before, maybe this is something that indicates some action needs to be taken, or maybe it's okay. Maybe an observer has a certain specialty and affinity for different parts of the framework and does a lot of observations in those areas. Or maybe this is a sign that this person is not comfortable with some of these elements and they haven't been scoring them because they don't understand the framework. And so maybe some follow-up is needed here. Again, it depends on the situation with your observers, but that's what this could tell you, is looking at the score distribution, looking at the score frequency by the observer can tell you who's scoring what. And then maybe there's some places where some observers are ignoring different elements in the framework. This chart is the observation count chart, and it's the first time in the dashboard we start to compare data from two different date ranges. So the light blue is our current date range, our primary date range, and the dark gray is our comparison date range. And what this is simply showing us is, for this date range, how many observations do the teachers have? And so you can see in our current date range, we kind of have a nice distribution here, pretty consistent 4 observations, with some variation on either side. We can see in the last year, we kind of had this camel hump where we had a peak of 28, but then kind of another peak over at 15. So there were some, inconsistencies here in terms of how observations were being done. Some were getting a lot and some weren't getting enough. And here it's a little bit more evenly distributed. But again, you decide what sort of date ranges you want to compare and what you're looking for in this chart. You could compare one semester to another semester, 1 year to another year, and then compare the pacing of the observations between those two periods. A similar chart is this one where we are showing the score counts. And in order to make this a little bit more readable, we group the scores by 5s. And so what this is showing us is that 25 teachers here in this light blue range, 25 teachers have 16 to 20 scores. So those teachers could have 17 scores, they could have 18 scores, they could have 19 scores. 25 teachers have scores that have 16 to 20 scores. Then 27 teachers have 21 to 25 scores. Maybe they have 22 scores, could be 23, could be 25. But what this will help us see is generally about how many scores do teachers have. And it will be up to you to decide, well, what's an appropriate number based on how we are using our framework and what framework we're using, and based on what sort of feedback maybe we're given. Maybe you wanted your observers to increase the number of elements that were getting scored from 1 year to the next, and you could use this chart to see if that was being done. Or maybe you just want them to keep pace with the previous year, and you could also check this to see if that was being done. You can also use this to see if there's any sort of odd outliers, like a handful of teachers that were getting scored on a lot of elements. Why would that be happening? It may be something that you'd want to investigate. Again, up to you what day range you want to compare and what you want to get out of that. One thing to mention is that this count does represent all scores, even if an element is scored more than once. So if there was one element that was scored 3 times, that score counts 3 times. So again, it's a count of the scores, not just how many individual elements were scored.